Yeah. First of all, I want to say thanks for being patient with this. Hopefully this works, this video works. So let's get right on head into it. We're going to finish up chapters 16, 17, and 18, and then just give you guys a little bit of insight about the final exam. Alright? So hopefully this works. We left off with chapter 16 on Roman numeral number 2, schools and formal organizations. So you will have a couple questions on this section, and starting off with part A, bureaucratization of schools, the 5 characteristics of a bureaucracy. So we're looking at the bureaucratization process of schools. The first thing that you guys need to note is that there are 5 characteristics of a bureaucracy. The first is that there's a division of labor, meaning that you typically have specialized experts. Every job has a division of labor, generally meaning that you have management, supervisors, you have technicians, you have different levels within the department. You have auxiliary, you have management, like I said, upper management. So there's always a division of labor. The second characteristic of a bureaucracy would be hierarchy of authority. As I stated earlier, generally there's management, upper management, and then there the general work pool or what have you, generally what are called the hourly workers. But hierarchy of authority, generally each employee of a school system is responsible to a higher authority. All right. Third characteristic of a bureaucracy would be written rules and regulations. Typically, there is a handbook that you're given on your first day of work that explains the policies and processes of the organization you're working with, and then in particular the actual job duties and what you're responsible for. So typically you get that on the first day of work. So the third characteristic will be written rules and regulations. The fourth characteristic is impersonality, basically meaning that typically most people work in large corporations, so most people don't have any personal connection. So there's this notion of impersonality to the whole bureaucratic process. And then the fifth characteristic is employment is based on technical qualifications. So basically, in theory, what this is saying is that typically you have to have some sort of certification or credentials in order to get most jobs that you have. But as you guys know, there are some jobs that are in which you're trained. You can be trained on, such as in law enforcement, but you still have to have certain base credentials in order to even qualify for those programs. So typically you have to have employment based on technical qualifications. So the 5 characteristics of a bureaucracy would be a division of labor. The first one. The second is that there is a hierarchy of authority. The third is written rules and regulations. The fourth is impersonality. And then 5 is that employment is based on technical qualifications. Alright, so that you probably have a couple questions on that part, looking at the bureaucratization process of schools. Alright, moving on along to part B. This is just looking at once again looking at talking about some of the conflicts that teachers run into, not only serving in like several different roles. As you guys know, typically the teacher is responsible for the teaching and learning that goes on in the room, but also, as you guys know, dealing with students, there are social work issues that you have to deal with, as well as being a disciplinarian. So in actuality, the teacher doesn't really get a chance to do as much teaching as he or she would like, because they have these other roles that they're also indirectly or directly responsible for. Alright, moving on along, student subcultures. Basically what this is just talking about is like some of the different cliques and things like that are formed in schools, and this starts as young as in elementary school. These different cliques in which you get the jock clique, the athlete clique, the quote-unquote nerd clique, the hippie clique. You know, those are some of the cliques that existed when I was in school. So that won't be on the exam, the student subculture, so you guys don't have to worry about that. So for the sake of the exam, the only thing that you guys need to worry about is part A, the whole 5 characteristics of the bureaucracy. So that's really all you need to know from the rest of chapter 16. Alright, so that's chapter 16, education. Now moving on along, chapter 17, politics. Basically looking at politics And let's just start off with a basic definition of looking at power and authority. And the struggle for power and authority inevitably always involves politics. Alright, so the struggle over power and authority, you have it right now. Coming in November, you have the Republicans and the Democrats fighting over the executive administration of the United States. So they're fighting for this power authority to see who's going to basically direct and provide the next round of economic programs for the country as we move forward in the next 4 to 8 years. Alright, so that's just looking at that, but that won't be on the exam. Alright, so a real basic definition of power. Now this will be on the exam. Max Weber defined power as the ability to exercise one's will over others. Alright, power is defined as the ability to exercise one will over others. So you may have one quick question on that. There are three basic sources of power within the political system. The first is force, and this is when you actual or threaten use of force. Typically, the U.S. government has used this against various different countries. One being the most recent use of force was a preemptive strike. That meaning that we launched bombs first without being attacked. That was against Iraq as well as against Afghanistan. So that would be the first country in which we've used actual real force within a more recent time period or what have you. And then threatened use of force would be what we have with North Korea, the economic sanctions that we have because of their underground nuclear war program that they're supposedly or allegedly trying to get started up. Alright, and then the second source of power would be influence. This is power through persuasion. This is an example would be the sort of power or influence that parents have over their kids to influence their political opinions, their opinions about marriage and things like that. So that would be an example. And then the third type of power would be authority. This is institutionalized power recognized by people over whom it is exercised. So an example would be the United States government would be considered the federal authority figure over the governance of the 50 states that make up the United States. So the three basic sources of power are force, influence, and authority. So you will have a question over those three types on the exam. Alright, three types of authority. Now we're looking at authority. Alright, once again, remember, authority was institutionalized power that are recognized by the people over whom is exercised. So there are three different types of authoritative power you can have, so to speak. Alright, the first is traditional power. Alright, traditional power is legitimate power conferred by custom and accepted practice. Alright, an example of traditional authority would be a monarchy, would be a king over his subjects or what have you. And you had that in feudal times and things like that. You really don't have too many real monarchies that really exist in contemporary times, but an example of that would be a monarchy, would be an example of traditional authority. Legitimate power conferred by custom and accepted practice. Alright, authority rests in custom but not in personal characteristics. So these individuals essentially assume power because of hereditary or bloodline. So that's why you have a monarchy being an example. The second type of authority would be legal rational authority. Alright, legal rational authority is derived from written rules and regulations of political systems. Alright, legal rational authority is authority derived from written rules and regulations of a political system. So an example will be, a clear example will be what we have here in the United States, and that is governance through the U.S. Constitution. That is how most of our federal laws are based off that, and that's the reason why we have a Supreme Court to decide whether or not certain cases that come before it violate or are in agreement with the U.S. Constitution. Alright, so we constantly have this ongoing process of looking at legal rational authority. Alright, and the third type of authority would be charismatic authority. And charismatic authority refers to power made legitimate by a leader's exceptional personal or emotional appeal. Typically, these are what typically an example of charismatic authority would be preachers, pastors, sports figures, things like that. All right, so this is based off emotional appeal and things like that. All right, authority is derived more from belief than actual qualities of a leader. All right, the media has facilitated the development of charismatic authority, meaning that individuals are given multiple different types of platforms to basically get a much wider audience or what have you. All right. Now let's move on along. So for the exam, you may have a question over the 3 types of authority. All right. Number 2, types of government. Just maybe one question, 1 or 2 questions, and this is real simple. There are 4 different types of government, and we talked a little bit about this. The first being the monarchy. Monarchy is a single member of a royal family holds power, and like I said, typically that is based off traditional authority. So the first type of government would be a monarchy. Like I said, there's not really too many contemporary monarchies. You do have the British, but the Queen Elizabeth, she does not have any formal authority over the governance of the British, Great Britain. She's more just a figurehead, so to speak. An example I think that you could use perhaps would be Saudi Arabia. They are governed by a king or what have you, and then I believe like 50 different crown princes who hold authority over various different industries that make up Saudi Arabia. But those are really some of the more contemporary examples. Oligarchy, the second type of government, is an oligarchy. An oligarchy is in which you have a form of governance in which a few individuals hold power. Alright, and typically this would be the military would be an example of an elite group of individuals holding power over a particular form of government. Alright, an example that I always give is the situation in which you have in Iran. In Iran, most people don't know, even though they have a president, the country is actually governed by a group of, I believe it's 15 imams called the Ayatollahs, and these are the religious leaders who represent various different regions of Iran, and they come together and they make law, and the president and the Iranian Legislative Council have to implement whatever law that they set, and there's something in disagreement with what they set forth, their law, their word has precedence over anything that the president or any other legislative body could say. Alright, so that would be the second type of government. The third would be a dictatorship, totalitarianism, and this is when a single person has near total power in a dictatorship. Alright, in a totalitarian state, control over people's lives is very overwhelming. So an example of a dictatorship would be Cuba and North Korea. Alright, so that would be an example of a dictatorship. And then the fourth form of government would be a democracy, and this is what you have ruled by the people. And this is when you have 2/3 of the countries that make up the world have some form of democratic sort of ideals. And I guess one of the featured countries would be what we have here in the United States. Alright, political behavior in the United States. You guys may have a couple questions on this, but as you guys know, I don't do percentages. Alright, so just FYI, most people are sort of not as political as you would think in the United States, especially as we've moved along in time. Back in the 50s and the 60s, people used to be extremely politically active, but only 62% of eligible voters actually voted in the last presidential election in 2008. So only 6 out of 10 adults actually voted in the election. In a lot of European countries, you may get a 80 to 90% voter turnout in a lot of these elections. And the reason why, typically, because whoever holds the power in a lot of those European countries, a person's very livelihood is affected by who wins these elections. So you could be literally become poor overnight based off who wins presidential elections in some of these European countries or whatever. Alright, so that's just FYI. That won't be on the exam. Alright. Moving on along. Models of power structure in the United States. Now, that will be, you may have 1 or 2 questions on this on the exam. And then all you need to know is looking at, once again, going back to this notion of an oligarchy. in which that's the second type of government, in which you have government ruled by a few elite individuals. And there was this sociologist called C. Wright Mills who developed this whole idea, this notion of a power elite, in which you had a oligarchy, or a group of few individuals that actually ran the United States. And these individuals typically came from the political sphere, the corporate sphere, and the military sphere. And typically they tried to align most of their interests together to basically govern the United States, and at the expense of the poor and working classes, or what have you. All right. So Mills' model about the power elite basically says that the power elite are leaders of military, industry, and governmental agencies that collectively control the fate of the United States. Mills suggested that the economically powerful coordinate the maneuvers with military and political establishments to serve their common interests. So a lot of people have made the argument that this was a clear example of the power elite operating, in which you had the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq in 2001. So in which you had corporate interests aligned with military interests, aligned with the political interests of the Bush administration. So all those three came together, and which created the atmosphere and the evidence in which Colin Powell went before the UN to provide justification for a preemptive strike against not only Afghanistan but the Iraqis as well. Alright, so that's a really great example. So you definitely may have a question looking at the power elite. Alright, the other part, Domhouse model, really I won't talk about that. That's just FYI, so we just leave that alone. So for the exam, you just need to know about the power elite. Alright, War and Peace. This is just real quick questions. This is just looking at I guess 3 different aspects of war and peace, and obviously you have war, peace, and then acts of terrorism. Alright, and we looked at a little bit about that early in the semester when we looked at the video on Mumbai, terror in Mumbai, in which we had the terrorists basically attack public areas in the city of Mumbai and killed over 172 people. Alright, so war is a conflict between organizations that possess trained combat forces equipped with deadly weapons. Alright, so right now the United States is at war, or was at war, with certain factions of the Saddam Hussein regime, and then the Taliban in Afghanistan. Alright, and then peace is considered both the absence of war and a proactive effort to develop cooperative relations among nations. An organization that sort of tries to promote peace, and since actually has a group called the Peacekeepers, are the United Nations. So the United Nations would be an example of a global organization that tries to promote peace and stability across the world, or what have you. And then terrorism is the third aspect of war and peace. And terrorism is the use or threat of violence against random or symbolic targets in a pursuit of political aims. Alright, terrorism is the use or threat of violence against random or symbolic targets in a pursuit of political aims. So the most recent example, as most of you guys know and girls know, would be the September 11th, 2001 attacks that occurred, in which the terrorists flew the planes into the World Trade Center. So that will be an example of terrorism here in the United States, and we've had many different examples in such places such as in Israel, to be more specific, in the Middle East, and then in London have had issues with terrorism or whatever. Alright? So that's Chapter 17, and that's all you guys need to know for the exam for Chapter 17. Now Chapter 18. Chapter 18 is the economy. Alright, so we're going to go through this quickly. It's not a lot that you guys really need to know, and we've been talking about this throughout the semester. Really what you guys need to know is about the 3 different types of the economy. 3 different types of economy. As you guys know, there's the capitalistic system, there's the socialist or communist system, and then there's the underground economy called the informal economy. Alright, so the first real 2 basic types of systems that you guys really need to know is the capitalism, and then socialism and communism. Alright, so capitalism is an economic system in which the means of production are largely in private hands. Alright, and the main goal, the main purpose of economic activity is to accumulate profits. All right, you want to accumulate as much profits as you can. All right, that's the whole thing. It's private. It's in free market economy, and the whole goal is to accumulate profits. All right. Monopolies violate the idea of free enterprise. All right. So, in most capitalistic countries, such as the United States, you don't have. It's very few companies in which you have a monopoly over. All right. Specifically, an example would be television and radio and television, radio, and print media. For example, the FCC makes it a point, the Federal Communications Organization makes it a point to monitor, making sure that companies don't buy up whole newspapers, television stations, as well as radio stations in a particular market, and basically have a monopoly, and basically can decide the sort of information that's being put on the airways, what we see and what we hear. So the government makes a point to watch certain industries to ensure that there's not a monopoly. All right. So that would be an example. And exceptions are, though, in utility and transportation industries. There is an exception given to those particular industries. All right, because there's a need for government regulation and things like that in those industries. All right. So moving on along, so that's capitalism. The second type of economic system would be socialism. All right, socialism is an ideal type that seeks to emulate what they call economic exploitation. As I stated earlier, typically in capitalism, you have the means of production that are in private hands. So by it being privately held, that means that it's held by a small group of individuals. All right, and then you have this small group of individuals, and then you have this large working class or group of workers that provide service, which is their labor, to this organization to make a particular product so they can then sell in the marketplace at a profit. So once again, that's the whole capitalism system. So socialism takes a whole flip side of that. All right. So they say they seek to eliminate what they call economic exploitation. The means of production and distribution are collectively owned by the people to meet the needs of the people rather than to maximize profit. So there's this collective ownership instead of private ownership. So that's that's a major difference between capitalism and socialism. Capitalism, there's private ownership. The whole goal is to accumulate profits, whereas in socialism, there's a collective ownership of a particular company or what have you. All right. An example of a real communist or socialist system would be what we have in China and Cuba. Those would be clear-cut examples of socialist and communist system. Now, places like Great Britain and Canada, they do have socialist aspects in certain parts of their economy, particularly in the welfare areas and then in healthcare. All right, because they do provide extensive health care to just about every citizen that lives in Great Britain as well as in Canada. If you're a citizen Canadian citizen as well as a British citizen, you get free health care. That's an example of sort of a socialist aspect of their economy and what have you. And then the third type of economy would be the informal economy, and this is what you have transfer of money and goods that are not reported to the government. These are illegal transactions such as gambling, prostitution, and drug dealing. Alright, so you may have just one question on that. Moving on along, capitalism in China, case study. This was just basically looking at how in the early 1990s, how Canada basically began to adopt and endorse free market economies. And basically what happened is, by endorsing that, that's the reason why China has become this global power essentially in the past 20 years, because they began to endorse free market economies. And what happened is that overnight, I remember early in the semester I was telling you guys about the reason why oil is so high. It's not because of what's happening. I mean, part of it is because of what's happening in Iraq and Iraq and Afghanistan, but that's just a little bit. The major reason is because overnight, in economies such as China and India, who really began to endorse free market capitalistic enterprise, they basically had a middle class to basically form overnight. And the first thing people do when they get money is they buy a car and then they buy a home. So overnight you had millions and millions of people who had this newfound wealth. First thing they do was went about a car. So now you have, with oil goes, you have the demand of oil is so high. So as you guys know, in capitalistic enterprise, there's demand and supply. So the demand is high, but the supply is low. So essentially, the oil-producing countries, which are a lot of Middle Eastern countries, they basically can charge whatever they want, and they charge them whatever they want, and they're making very high profits. So most of the countries, or most of the #1 ranked countries on the Fortune 100 list are oil companies. So you have BP, Amoco, as well as ExxonMobil. Those typically are in the top 5 as far as Fortune 100 companies. All right, but that won't be an exam. That was just an FYI. All right, moving on along, work and alienation. Once again, in Marx's view, he believed that industrialization robbed workers of meaningful relationships with work, meaning that they didn't have a connection with the things that they were producing. They were just providing a service, which was their labor to make a product, so there was no connection to the means of production. All right. So alienation refers to a condition of estrangement and disassociation from surrounding society. And basically what Marx suggested was that workers needed a greater control, and then over time what happened was that in order to get greater control in the workplace, a lot of workers founded coalitions, and these coalitions end up forming skilled and unskilled work unions, and which helped to establish better working conditions, better wages, better health care, and things of that nature for hourly workers or what have you. All right. So moving on along, you may have that on the exam, just one question. Then the last piece that you guys are going to have is just looking at the different types of changing economies that are going on now in this global workforce. The first being the face of the workforce. As you guys know, we talked about this whole issue of immigration, and as the United States moves forward, it's going to become a more browner looking country. Overnight, close to a third of the population that they project in the next 20 years is going to be racial minorities, meaning black people, people of African descent, as well as people of Hispanic or Latino descent. They're going to make up a sizable majority of this country in the next 20 to 25 years. So because of that, you're going to see a changing face of the workforce. So the number of black, Latino, and Asian American workers will continue to increase at a faster rate than the number of white workers. Alright, so basically you're going to find overnight a lot of white people, the younger generation, more than likely they're going to come into a lot of instances in which a lot of their supervisors and a lot of their co-workers are going to be people of color, which is going to be drastically different from their parents' generation, and definitely from their grandparents' generation, in which you had essentially an all-white and even all-white male workforce. Alright, so that's the first a part of changing the economy, is the changing face of the workforce. So you definitely will have a question on that on the exam. The second piece is deindustrialization. That will be on the exam. And this is basically looking at places like Gary, Indiana, LA, Detroit, Flint, Pittsburgh, and which refers to the systematic, widespread withdrawal of investment or industry in basic aspects of productivity for a particular community. So basically it refers to the systematic, widespread withdrawal of investment from a particular community. So an example that I give in places like Gary would be in which you had the U.S. Steel downside. So overnight you had communities such as Gary, East Chicago, and Hammond, in which you had employment. 30 to 50,000 people were employed in some shape or form by the steel industry. Overnight those people were laid off. And these were people that were laid off, and they had no skills to apply to another particular type of industry. So overnight, those people lost their homes. Subsequently, all of the auxiliary businesses that supported these individuals, they then had to close and move out. And so that basically, overnight in the late 70s, early 80s, led to the demise of places like Gary, Indiana. You look at places like Flint, Michigan, their industry was the car industry. And overnight, when places like GM, Chrysler, when they either downsized or closed, a lot of those communities, such as Detroit and Michigan, they basically crumbled overnight. So that's a clear example of deindustrialization. So you have industry basically pulling out a particular community. All right. So the social costs of deindustrialization include unemployment, loss of family cohesion, and marital unhappiness, and then that subsequently leads to high crime rates. And you have places like Gary, Indiana. The third type of changing economy, aspect of a changing economy, is offshoring, and this is basically saying that basically U.S. companies are taking jobs that Americans used to do and moving them offshore and giving them to non-U.S. citizens. An example would be, I know a lot of you guys may have credit cards, and now if you call to and speak to someone, generally, I know with a lot of my credit card companies, there's been someone of Indian descent, a background with an Indian accent. And actually, when you call those 1-800 numbers, that number is being routed to a place over in the country of India, and you are speaking to someone who's been trained by an American to basically handle your customer service needs, because they can provide the service at a much cheaper rate than what it would cost to employ an American here in the United States. All right. So offshoring firms, and a lot of U.S. companies have been doing this for generations and generations. All right. So basically, the whole goal, the reason why they do it, is to increase profits. The cheaper your labor, the higher your profits. It's just pure economics. And the reason why they do it, a lot of you got companies like Maytag. They've relocated to Mexico. You have certain U.S. automakers. They've relocated certain aspects of their car making to certain parts of Latin America, such as Mexico and things like that. So a lot of U.S. companies do this, believe it or not. All right. And then the last type of changing economy will be microfinancing. And microfinancing is the practice of lending